So, thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So, another Ukraine update video. So, there is a bulge forming in the line around the city of Pokrovsk. So, if we go to deepstatemap.com, we can see from the map there's a bulge forming in the line right here. So, after the Russians captured the city of Avdiivka, they've been pushing towards Pokrovsk. There's been a concentrated effort to take Hrodivka. So if you look at the map, Hrodivka, most of the settlement and the town is under Russian control, the entire eastern section, with much of the rest of the settlement under what they would consider toss-up or is contested. So basically, we're going to draw. Oops. I was trying to move the map. There we go. Okay. So there is a bulge in the line. Basically, after the capture of Avdiivka, the Russians have been pushing towards Pokrovsk, because if you look at Pokrovsk, it looks like a very strategic rail and road junction. So major roads converge. I talked about in my previous video, if the Russians are able to push across, I don't know if this is a river or a creek, but able to push across that body of water and to sever that road link, then that would make it harder for the Ukrainians to push men and materiel to Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar. So there is a bulge forming in the line. If we look along the front line, not a whole lot's changed in this direction. There's been fighting around Vuhledar. Looks like the Russians are trying to push along the flanks of Vuhledar in this direction, in this direction. So it looks like the Russians are trying to push and trying to encircle Vuhledar from the north. Not a whole lot of success in that area. There's been a Russian thrust, most likely to try and link up with the forces in Ukrainsk. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. It looks like the Russians are trying to push south and also trying to push. So there's a bulge here in the line. So it looks like a lot of this area right here is contested. And if the Russians are able to continue to push, then the Ukrainian troops in this area would be under threat of encirclement, and that's obviously not a good thing. So the Russians are trying to push and this is a semi-encircled Ukrainian part of the line. The Russians are making a concerted effort around Hrodivka, trying to push towards Pokrovsk. There's been fighting around New York. Looks like the Ukrainians have had a small counteroffensive where they pushed the Russians back across this creek, but the Russians are still trying to work their way into Toretsk, Andriivka still holding out. Chasiv Yar, not a whole lot of movement in the line. I believe the Russians have the Canal micro-district under their control, but that has been more or less stagnant around Chasiv Yar. Looks like the Ukrainians were able to have a partial counterattack in that direction. More or less, this part of the line has been stagnant. The Russians are trying to push towards the Oskil Reservoir, because if the Ukrainians can't push the Russians back, then that would severely threaten all of this part of the line, and then would potentially have to have the Ukrainians withdraw behind the Oskil Reservoir, and that would put cities like Kupiansk and Izium under stress. Not a whole lot of fighting. The fighting has more or less subsided around Vovchansk. Personally, I think the Ukrainians should pull back from the Kursk direction, because if you look at it, Ukrainians have been putting a lot of troops and personnel into the Kursk direction, and while that's happening, the Ukrainians are losing ground around Donetsk, around Hrodivka, around Pokrovsk. So since the Ukrainians are focusing on Kursk, the Russians have forced territorial gains around Pokrovsk, and there is this bulge forming in the line, and if the Russians are able to exploit that, then that could be detrimental to the Ukrainians. The fall of Pokrovsk would be very not good, because that's a major road and rail link, and that also is a road link to Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka, and more. So there's some bulges forming on the line around Vuhledar, around Pokrovsk, around Chasiv Yar. So, but the one that I really want to focus on is this Pokrovsk, because the Russians have made a lot of gains in this area ever since the fall of Avdiivka, fall of Ocheretine, and the Russians are trying to encircle the Ukrainians here, trying to outflank the Ukrainians around Vuhledar, and really push around Hrodivka on their way to try and force their way into Pokrovsk. So that's more or less the status of the front at the moment. Not a whole lot of movement, but if you look at it, there's definitely a bulge in the line right here. So very interesting developments, and I'll make another update video when more develops. So I'll see you all in the next video. Deuces.